Hello, NASCAR Fantasy Racing fans. Welcome to Dan Beaver's NASCAR Fantasy Pit Stop. This week we're going to talk about Watkins Glen and the second road course race on the Sprint Cup Series schedule. This one's my favorite. Of course, I'm Charlie Turner, and I'm joined by the NASCAR Fantasy Racing guru, Dan Beaver. Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm doing good. Just trying to stay out of the heat.
Watkins Glen. Totally different, really, type of racetrack from the other road course that we run the Sprint Cup Series at, which is at Sonoma. Sonoma being much more technical in nature as far as the driving goes. Watkins Glen, faster, smoother, would seem to me be more of a rhythm track. Agree, disagree, comment?
Definitely faster, and I think both courses are rhythm tracks. But if you lose your momentum through a corner at Watkins Glen, the penalty is much greater because you lose so much more on those long straights that they have. So yeah, dead on, I think.
Okay, so what other than Sonoma, what can you use and Sonoma and past performance and records at road courses in general, Watkins Glen in particular? Is there any place else that you can take performance from and apply it to your selections this week when you're going to Watkins Glen?
Not really, but I think those two road courses, we've been coming here long enough for the drivers with more than 1 or 2 years under their belts. That's enough of a pattern that you can make pretty decent picks. There aren't a lot of dark horses that show up on road courses, including the road ringers. It's kind of the usual cast of characters in the top five, and then you get a variety of drivers in that 6th to 15th range. And those drivers tend to be relatively consistent. Whether or not they're getting top tens or finishing in the teens shifts from time to time.
You think there's a? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, you.
You think there's a trend with maybe more novice fantasy racing players to, in particular, I'm thinking more in terms of a salary cap game, to go with ringers at these road courses because they generally cost less?
They're attractive for that reason, and for a while they were doing pretty well. We've got Ron Fellows had a handful of top fives, top tens. Boris Said has a handful of top fives, top tens, and they were doing it in equipment that wasn't necessarily the best equipment on the track. I think Boris Said second place finish came for MB3 Motorsports. So it wasn't the best equipment, and he just made the most of it. As the Cup guys have figured out that road course racing is just as important, you've got the same chance to win there. You get the same number of points for these two races, and that they couldn't give up a single race. That's what made the difference. That's where the gap got closed. So drivers like Clint Boyer, drivers like Martin Truex Jr., that are not by any stretch of the imagination road ringers, elevated their game to the point that they became consistent 6th to 15th place picks and changed the landscape quite a bit. Now Boris Said if he gets a 20th, should be happy, and that makes him less attractive across the board in all games, although it does make him a provisionally good pick if he fills that last niche in your roster and allows you to take one other driver that you really wanted to take in the top part of your salary cap.
So when you're picking salary cap rosters for this or the other road course race, do you start at the top or you start at the bottom?
Start in the middle, kind of. There are some good consistent drivers that are not going to break the bank. You look at them first, I think. Then you drop to the bottom, see if you can get somebody like a Boris Said or a Nelson Piquet Jr. at a bargain basement price, and think with a relatively decent chance of finishing somewhere in the 20s. And then you go and look and see if you can get 1 or 2 marquee drivers. So in that middle range, you've got some decent picks. I already mentioned Martin Truex Jr. being a pretty good road course racer. He's let me look at my notes here. Top 15 finishes in his last 4 road course starts. Top 15 finishes in 6 of the last 7. So you're going to get quite a good bang for your buck out of that. Actually, top 15's in 1, 2, 3, 8, 7 of the last 8. So nice, consistent racer. Casey Mears has a lot of finishes in the low teens in the last 4 or 5 plate races, or I'm sorry, road course races. So he's another good pick in the salary cap game. When we jump down the second half of this thing and start talking about Yahoo, probably not so much there, because he's in Group B, where he's in competition with a Marcus Ambrose or an AJ Allmendinger, who I think have to be considered as favorites for a top 15. But in a salary cap game, Mears is going to be right in that sweet spot. Then you jump up to the top. You look for the drivers that are either going to be expensive because they've been expensive all year, or drivers that got hyped for this race. Marcus Ambrose, if salary cap managers doing their job, should have jumped him up a little bit in the past couple of weeks to accommodate this one race. Jeff Gordon, though, you might want to take him, you might not. We'll probably talk about him a little, or actually we'll talk about him now. He was great on Watkins Glen for a while, but he's been horrible in the last 12 races. Has an average finish outside the top 20 in the last 12 races here. So you're going to look for those kinds of drivers that are trending the wrong way at this track and avoid them. Jimmy Johnson's been consistently good on road courses, so he might be that marquee driver you take. Or Kyle Busch, who won 2 of the last 3 races at Watkins Glen. He might be that marquee driver that you take. And you only know how much you have to spend a lot of times at the top by managing the bottom and the middle.
Okay, so I mean, any other I think that pretty well covers it. Is this an easier race to pick than?
Yes and no. It's an easier race to pick because there's not the drivers who suggest themselves are pretty logical, and the drivers who suggest themselves are going to be on the majority of rosters. Last year, Marcus Ambrose crashed inside of the checkers at Watkins Glen, spoiling a perfect top 3 record at that track. But he didn't hurt anybody, really, because almost everybody had him on their roster. So you play it safe with some of those picks, and you roll the dice maybe with those middle picks. A Casey Mears is not going to be on a lot of rosters. So if he performs like I think he will and gets that low top 10 finish, then you're going to win your league based on that versus whether or not you've got Ambrose or Allmendinger or Tony Stewart on your roster. What it becomes a little more difficult to find that perfect dark horse, that perfect pick that's going to fit that middle part of your roster. And that can be risky. Casey Mears can get involved in an incident just as much as Martin Truex Jr., just as much as Marcus Ambrose. And if he's your differentiator, then that's going to be what keeps you from winning your roster, your league this week.
All right. Well, I think that pretty well covers us specifically for salary cap type games this week. Let's swing over and start talking about the Yahoo game and YahooSports.com. Of course, Dan, this is a good time to mention this. Dan writes the absolute best article about analyzing fantasy racing picks for the Yahoo game, and it's on Yahoo Sport. Yeah, easy for me to say. YahooSports.com every week. So make sure you're bookmarking that article and getting that info every week, because it's absolutely the best, most in-depth coverage of the upcoming race every week. So after giving you all those kudos, let's get to live. What's it all about, Alfie? Or should be what's it all about, Beaver? Info on Watkins Glen and the Yahoo game.
Well, and on that PDF, even if you're not reading the all of the editorial, and it's 21 pages long, I understand why.
It's a book.
I understand why it's a monster. You might not want to read it all. Some weeks I don't want to write it all. But there's a ton of stats in there too, and the stats kind of point you in a certain direction. Where the Yahoo game's concerned, Group A continues to be Group A. It's all marquee drivers. Any of those drivers up there can possibly break into the top 10, given the right set of circumstances. But there are 2 that set themselves apart this week based on their road course performance. Kyle Busch, we already mentioned, is one of the marquee drivers in the salary cap game. Excuse me. But he's also a good pick here at Watkins Glen. He's one of the drivers who seems to know the difference between Sonoma and Watkins Glen. Does not perform well on the technical Sonoma course, but he performs almost perfectly on the high-speed Watkins Glen track. And he enters with an 8-race top 10 streak. The only time he failed to finish that well was in his first attempt way back in 2005. One of those races, he had to get the free pass 4 or 5 times to get back into contention, and then come from the back of the pack and finish in the top 10. He's won he won last year. He won again in 2008, or won also in 2008. So Kyle Busch, I think, is probably the driver that most people should pick in Group A. You get past him, and then Clint Bowyer's a nice, solid pick. Bowyer's been doing consistently well on road courses combined. At Watkins Glen, he's finished 11th or better in his last 3 starts. On the combined I'm having a hard time remembering what track type this is, aren't I? On the combined road courses, his worst finish is that 11th at Watkins Glen back in 2011 in his last 7 attempts. So not someone. I keep saying this, and I guess maybe I need to modify it now because he should be front of mind for a lot of players on road courses now. But he's not necessarily the driver that you would think had the background to be one of the favorites on a road course until now. So Bowyer, I think, is definitely one of those drivers that in Group A, that's who are on my roster at the moment, Kyle Busch and Bowyer. Probably will start Kyle Busch, but it's nice to have Bowyer there in reserve. Johnson's got a nice long streak of top 10s on road courses. And after you get past them, it gets to be a little more hit and miss. Harvick was great at Watkins Glen for a while and has fallen off. Jeff Gordon was great for a while and has fallen off. So I think you're going to make your choices between those 2 drivers. But the good news is they haven't been so productive this year that they've exhausted allocations up until now. Dropping down to Group B, you've got Ambrose and Allmendinger, I think, who anchor it. Both of them were favorites to earn top 5s at Sonoma. Ambrose has been almost perfect here in Watkins Glen. He struggled a little bit last year, even before he got into that accident. But if he gets a solid top 10 finish, that's great for a Group B driver. One reason the Group A drivers haven't performed nearly as well is because they are getting consistently outproduced in the Yahoo game by Group B. Allmendinger was challenging, I think, for a top 10, for a top 5, running in between Jeff Gordon and Dale Earnhardt Jr. at Sonoma when he got knocked off track by Earnhardt. Up until then, he was going to have a great finish. Those 2 drivers went to finish in the top 3, and Allmendinger faded. But this is his chance to get a little revenge on the field. So he's going to be a good pick. Martin Truex Jr., better than average road course racer. So he probably is that 3rd person. Mears might be your 4th person in Group B. I said in the first half of the segment that probably you wouldn't want to pick him because there's so many other choices. But if you think Brad Keselowski is going to run better elsewhere, if you think Tony Stewart is not going to live up to expectations, then you might want to roll the dice if you need to make up some ground with the Casey Mears. And if he finishes somewhere around 11th to 14th, and any of those other drivers stumble, he could be that driver that helps you win your league. If not him, Truex.
Before you go to the Group C drivers, I want to make a point here about this and ask you a question, because it comes up in what you just discussed there. We have, I think, 4 more races before the chase starts, 4 or 5, before the chase actually starts. Once we get into those last 10 races, the drivers that are going to finish up top are generally going to be the guys that are in the chase. So we're going to have 16 probably favorites. And at this point in the season, and however many more races deep we go before we get to those actual chase races, you are going to have allocations exhausted. Do you start thinking about that here? I mean,
should have started thinking about it before.
Yeah, I mean, you should have, obviously, but if you haven't, shouldn't you start thinking about it now? You want to be able to save there's only so many Group A drivers. Do you want to be able to save the ones that are definitely going to be in the chase at this point, or points regardless?
Some of them, and I've been saying for a couple of weeks now, avoid Jimmy Johnson until the chase starts. Yeah. Partly because they're experimenting wildly, yeah, and partly because he's going to be good in the final 10 races. So it would be hard to get me to start Johnson in the next 5 races. Jeff Gordon, he can be a streaky driver. He's going to be in the chase. He's having a career year, but he's had some difficulty in the chase since the new format. So you probably want to save back some starts for him. You certainly will want to start him at Martinsville when that rolls around. You're probably going to start him at least on one of the unrestricted intermediate speedways, the mile-and-a-halfers. Pick which one, kind of. Maybe Charlotte, maybe Texas. And then make sure you save back an allocation for Earnhardt for Talladega. Not the Pied Piper he used to be, but still a great Pied Piper. So a great pick on the plate races.
Right.
So you want to look and see. And Eric Almirola, he's going to be in the chase? Nah, you're not going to worry about him one way or the other.
Well, you probably got plenty of allocations left for him anyway, in most cases, I would think.
Right. And Denny Hamlin with his hit-and-miss season, you might want to save back allocations for the flat tracks. He seems to have gotten his flat track mojo back. But for the most part, that's about the only place you're going to consider him. So the answer is yes, but kind of provisionally yes. You want to look and see exactly what it means.
Okay, so we have 15 races to go. Looking at the C drivers, Kyle Larson and Austin Dillon are going to be. Some people probably already used them up, or at least one of them.
Probably, and by the numbers, Austin Dillon is the guy that I ranked number 1 in Yahoo. Doesn't mean that I would start him. I won't start him. He's not even on my provisional roster because I'm going to save him for one of those unrestricted. I'm saving for an unrestricted oval.
This is a place. This is kind of like almost a no-brainer to pick one of those ringers, isn't it? In a C, if they're rated C, I guess.
I don't think so. I think the top driver behind Dillon might be Danica Patrick. She's got an average finish on the road courses in 3 starts of about 22 point something, a little bit low 22s. But she's gotten progressively better each time she's raced. I think she went from 29th last June at Sonoma to 20th at the Glen last year to 18th this year. And if that progression can continue, she's going to be around that 15th place mark. Much more likely that she's going to finish 15th than it is that Borisset's going to finish 20th. So I think Danica Patrick might be your go-to racer this week. You might want to put Borisset on your provisional roster so that you can activate him if he's got a great practice. The problem with Set is he is so aggressive on road courses. I think someone once described him as a Doberman with a hand grenade in his mouth.
Yeah, and he's made some enemies because of that too, I think.
He has. And this is not a good place to have enemies. If you get just a little out of shape through one of those high-speed corners, the result can be catastrophic. Yeah. Not only for you, but for every driver that's behind you, because there's some nice pinch points on this track where things narrow up in a hurry. So I'd be afraid of Sed just getting knocked off track at an inopportune time. Not to say anything about his road racing ability, probably one of the 5 best road course racers in the field this week, but he's not going to get a top 5 finish out of that because of the baggage that he carries with him.
Yeah, he's a great driver on road courses in these big, heavy cars. He really knows how to do that. He's quite a craftsman. He's a good guy, too. He's been a guest on our On Pit Row show many times. He's actually a friend of the show, and I like him. I wish I thought he could contend still, but I think those days are those years are gone. Well, before we wind this one up, I want to give everybody a warning. This is Dan Beaver's Fantasy Pit Stop, right? Charlie Turner picked A.J. Allmendinger for this race, so beware, folks, just so you know.
Well, watch the hashtag BeavJinx. That pops up from time to time, too.
Yeah, I know it does. All right, well, any last thoughts on Watkins Glen before we call it a day today?
Not really. I guess the final thought is allocation management. Don't use anybody here that would be a much better pick someplace else. You've got some great options to stretch those allocations on drivers that are good on unrestricted ovals. So you got Talladega coming up a little bit. You've got some road short course races coming up in a little bit where you've got a few more chances to not to think outside the box. But for the most part, the rest of the season is going to be on a lot of unrestricted ovals, a mile up in length, and you want to save your marquee drivers for those races.
Yeah, you want to save Jimmy Johnson for Dover. You just got to put him in there right now and don't even think about it. That's just a used allocation already.
Yeah.
Okay, he is Dan Beaver. You can read his terrific fantasy racing report for Watkins Glen at yahoosports.com every week. Big article. Download the whole PDF and keep it in your library. It'll be handy next year as well. Also, you can read Dan's stuff at rotoworld.com. And he is, of course, the co-editor along with myself for On Pit Row Magazine. Second issue coming out here very shortly, and we hope you'll take a look at that. Go to the App Store and download the free application. Subscribe. You get a couple of months free, and tell us what you think. So, Dan, thanks again. I will talk to you, I'm sure, over the next couple of days as we prepare that next issue of the magazine. And, of course, we'll be back here next week to talk about where are we going after Watkins Glen? I don't remember. Charlotte next? No. Michigan. That's right. I'm going to be there. Why don't I remember that?
You might want to remember that.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be at another road course the day before. I'm actually going to get a chance to go to see the Nationwide Series cars at Mid-Ohio, which looking forward to that again. Was there last year. So,
Nice.
All right, folks, for Dan Beaver and for me, Charlie Turner, thanks for joining us, and we will see you again next week on Dan Beaver's Fantasy Racing Pit Stop.